you saw, the two speeches were quite different, and so before I will open the discussion in favor of the public, I would like to create some comparison platform. You are asked, but only in a short manner, to give us another and additional information about the political management in balancing these different areas within Yugoslavia in the interwar period, so the management of the government. You got some information about the structural aspects, but not on the political consequences. And you are asked shortly to give us a short overview about the geographical profile of the Hungarian economy. Because we know that Budapest was more or less the industrialized center, but around are there any other industrialized centers, or is only agrarian sphere or whatever? Because then we can compare these two countries.
Political aspect. Well, because of the time, I intentionally didn't talk about, and it's a complex, very complex question. And I think that during the interwar period, it didn't happen that political could solve the economic issues, these regional economic issues. Why? Because it was a very complex country. In the time of creation, 1980, 1990, in every, and I mean every economic aspect, you have several laws, for example. You have several monetary at the beginning, and everything was complicated to merge one. So the state started to solve one problem. And first it was, for example, the external trade. You have one tariffs, you have one duty, duty customs. Then it was famous monetary questions about crown and silver, and during the whole existence of Kingdom of Yugoslavia, everyone would go back because Croatia and Slovenia thought that it was bad for them and it was not good, while Serbia thought that voluntary reforms that took place was justified. So, in my opinion, that police didn't wake up. They started, but never didn't succeed to change economic problem. But when I said economic problem, I mean structural economic problem, because you got the law about labor, for example, but you don't respect that law. You said that workers must work only 8 hours per day, but yet you have some way that they don't do that. So I think that the structural problem the ruling government couldn't solve and it didn't solve during these two decades.
Yes, the problems are evident, but did the economy policy have some priority, or is it only after other questions?
Well, I think that economy gets some place in policy when Milan Studenovic came to power. Why? Okay. During the economic crisis, all the state tried to work out for economy, and there was a lot of policies, but there are some thoughts, and that the economy was in first place for the politicians when Milan Studenovic came. Before it was just something that you must deal with. So the dictator did do enough. First, you have in 20s very bad consequences for Serbia, and you needed to establish an organization of the economy. You even didn't have time to think of some further economic and structural problems during the 20s. Then it came Great Depression, and we needed to deal with the Great Depression. And in 35, when Studenovic came,
Yes.
in somehow the economic got some little more spaces than before.
So we have heard that Hungary lost a lot of territory around the center, and now the core space at which of the economic profile? As a background of your message.
Well, it's actually something I didn't go into, so I'm grateful for this opportunity to address that part. We have colleagues in the research program I mentioned who are projecting on maps for the first time using far more data than before, both pre-1918 and post-1920 distribution of the GDP production, the labor force composition, and so on. And some of the findings are interesting. So let me just say that already before 1918, the single largest contributors to Hungarian GDP were Budapest by far and Petrozseny, which is just of the iron gates, right? A huge mining complex with very rapidly developing industry as well. So it wasn't just Budapest pulling the Hungarian economy. In fact, during the late part of the dualist period, you have the emergence, and this is what I want to emphasize, of secondary centers that are both in Pennsylvania and in some other areas. The early dualist dynamism of Budapest spreads. So the loss is very real. At the same time, if you compare the composition of the labor force in historical Hungary before 1918 and the Kingdom of Hungary post-1920, the ratio of industrial workers is actually higher. If you control for the Budapest data, so if you take Budapest out of the equation, you get a minor decrease, but not a large one, because there were many tertiary industrial centers in Miskolc, Tatabánya, elsewhere, which already were developed, and in general, these were higher GDP areas than most of the areas that were lost, even if you take Budapest out of the picture. So it's not true what Hungarian, at least not fully true, what Hungarian propaganda was projecting towards the international community very often, which was basically that you left an agricultural country behind and a huge pumpkin head Budapest that will not be able to survive. That wasn't entirely true. At the same time, it is also true, and I think this is what deserves analysis, that there was little potential for growth because of the cut upstreams of raw resources going to stages of processing. So this kind of production chains were in fact interrupted. And you don't have, except for a few sectors that experience rapid growth, you don't have the potential to grow very quickly. Textile industries go quickly because of the new protective customs, which were previously procured from the Czech lands and Austria. you have some novel industries, but that's more characteristic of the 30s. Electro-engineering, the aluminum industry. So during the Badland period, you actually have a fairly stagnant image, much more so than we would normally imagine.
Thank you very much. Now we have several people who will break the ice, which does not exist. Perhaps you, please.
Yes, my question goes to both colleagues. One aspect which affected all successor states of Austro-Hungary was the question of new national currency and monetary question. So in Yugoslav space in the country, immediately after the war, it was risen quickly as a matter of propaganda how Austrian crown was changed into the with the dinar, and it's still in a legacy promulgated by historians nowadays. So, in spite of some efforts that the question was a complex one and many things influenced that, and that there was no deliberate intention to conquer former Austrian territories, Hungarian territories, and Belgrade or Serbia. So, what is your scope? What
Would you like to answer directly or to collect?
As you prefer. As you prefer.
Otherwise, then answer please, and then we will come to you.
Okay. Well, the question is has several aspects, I believe, and from the economic point of view, I don't think it's ever investigated in a good way or in a good manner. Why? Because first, no one ever did investigated the prices and currency in Zagreb, Tirana, and Belgrade in the beginning of the 20s. The lack of data, unwilling researchers, it's all the reasons, and because of that, I don't think that that economic point of view anyone can say what is the right ratio, is to say 1 to 4 or 1 to 3. The other economic aspect, which is political aspect, which is also very important because everything you read about in interwar period, and sometimes you go back to that question, is something that I think it should be reconsidered. Why? Because in some sources you can find that even 1 to 4 wasn't a good ratio for the people. It was a very good ratio for big enterprises, because they got a lot from that to change currency, especially later in 26 and 27, when there was some kind of polarization of all capital that existed. So that question should be investigated more. I would say that if we wanted to see the clear picture of if you would follow that period.
Thank you. I will give a short question because other people are waiting.
I will then not answer the whole question, only one part, and if it's something that's important for you, just let me know. I just want to highlight one thing then. Hungary has a much more conservative mindset also enforced by international banking than, for instance, Germany. So when you have hyperinflation, you get rid of domestic debt at a social cost, right? Those who have wrote Kriegsverleihen, war loans, lose their money. There's pauperization of a part of society, but the state can be freer. Now, after that comes consolidation. This is the interesting question. Hungary didn't want to get rid of the old currency. It was considered that it's our currency. So, you know, a respectable country hangs on to its own currency. But once hyperinflation was underway, it was actually probably allowed to run rampant a little bit. And then when consolidation came, the solution was one that was even more conservative, far more conservative than the German one. Hungary returned to the gold standard partially. And so the new tango became a source of pride, but also behaved much like the French franc when the economic crisis hit. The French also undertook huge pains to go back to the gold standard, only to be hamstrung by their monetary policy come 1929. So Hungary was conservative like the French, wanted to emulate that, if anything, far more conservative than the German solution, which was sort of a hypothetical solution, a broad credit solution for stabilizing the currency. If there's another aspect that I should address, but I think this is the most telling aspect of the conservatism of the undertaking.
Thank you. It's your turn now.
Well, obviously both of your presentations raised a lot of attention here, so I will be very short and I have two questions for both of you. First one deals with the question of ownership of the companies that existed before the war and continued their work after the establishment of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. So what was the legal and political framework inside which that process of ownership transformation or ownership change took place in Yugoslavia? And the other one deals with your analysis and the facts that you raised in your first part of your presentation, and it deals with the anti-Semitic regulation or anti-Semitic laws introduced in 1920s in Hungary. So how they fit in your analysis of that first period of Hungarian establishment.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was a law on property postal states, and it was a law that passed during the First World War. It was against Austria, Germany, all the other states which were involved in Serbia. After the First World War, that law was passed through all the country, and what it should be that law doing is that every property which is in the hand of enemies became Yugoslav property. However, I think that nationalization never carried out. It was only on the paper, and for example, textile industry, it was the biggest textile enterprises in Heppner, for example, Bulgaresa, it was Austrian, and capital before the war, it stayed, and after the war. What was happening? That you sold the shares, but you sold the shares, and for example, that shares by first the Croatian bank or by Yugoslavian bank. And you can't see who is standing behind that bank and who buying that shares in the end. So it was just rearranged capital. And for example, then someone took, for example, English English passport, and he became a friend of Serbia. He's a Greek, for example. There was a lot of ways, but for textile industry, I know correctly that there was there is no factory that was nationalized. In some other, in some other economy, in some other industry, not textile, but the heavy one, as I said, there were some states nationalization, but not in a way that it was took and it was given to someone. It was just from the state. It was how to say, heavy industry, and there is a very important role for exporters. I don't think that nationalization was took place in that manner, which is sometimes represented in some quarters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great question, because I think anti-Semitism is actually a great perspective or telescope to look down upon, and it highlights some of the contradictions of the system there. So, but I mean, very important to remember that there is no anti-Semitic legislation under the Bethlen government. The numerus clausus law is passed in 1920 before Bethlen. It limits the number of people who can enter university based on religious affiliation. And that's the only piece of legislation you have in the 1920s, in fact up until 1938. So that law is already a compromise between conservatives who would rather not have a law, but are anti-Semites culturally, but would rather not have a law because it goes against constitutional tradition, and right radicals who would like a much stricter law. And famously, it's these two groups who both compete for power but also cooperate in the 1920s, early on. And the Teleki government of 1920, which passes this law, is in fact a sort of a coalition of these competing forces. Now, when Bethlen's vision, if you like, and his government's policy is to increasingly disregard this law and then relax it formally in 1928 when economy is booming, it seems you can get away with it. So it's relaxed in 1928 with a new piece of legislation. But, and this is the interesting part, the anti-Semitism of the era doesn't go away. And what enables Bethlen to do this is that he has his comfortable majority, the right radicals are dependent on him for position, many of them have been asked back into the fold, but they had to sort of formally stop spreading anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism. But at the same time, if you look at the Hungarian press and how much of the Catholic press writes about Jewish property, so Jewish ideas, quote unquote, by which they mean liberalism, then you can see that the Bethlenian consolidation is something that extends to the level of formal or institutional politics, if you like, but it doesn't penetrate large areas of those Hungarian middle-class thinking that have been, if you like, already counter-revolutionized by 1920. So those social cultural institutions are largely there. We could have a long argument about to what extent Hungarian anti-Semitism in the non-Jewish middle classes subsides. I think it's limited. Some people would argue that the 1920s see an actual more significant decrease. I think the decrease is more in the thin political elite, which cooperates very tightly with industrialists, many of whom are Jewish, and who are very important allies to this system, and especially the Hungarian Industrialists Association, the Deutsche Industriebund, the Hungarian equivalent of the Industriebund. which is usually has a Jewish president, Miksa Fenyő, who is a liberal but is also an ally of Bethlen in many cases. So I think you can see that the easing of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic constraints on the Jewish population is something that Bethlen welcomes while being a cultural anti-Semite himself, but not a legal anti-Semite. And he's successful within his political top echelon, if you like, to achieve real result. But then penetrating society and changing societal mentalities, which are deeply ingrained with a more radical version of anti-Semitic thinking, I think that his system, frankly, is not really equipped to do that. And there's much less success in redrawing, middle class, right-wing intellectual thinking in the 1920s than it would seem.
Yeah, you said that the finance minister Gergely should try to stabilize the finances by introducing the tax on wealth, and that it failed. Now, why was that? Because the opposition of the property classes, did they subvert the law, or what happened?
It is a combination of factors, and to give a short answer, yes, of course, there was opposition. There's also the understanding, coming back to anti-Semitism, that the tax on wealth would hit Jewish industrialists the hardest, so it was fundamentally something that could be supported by a non-liberal right. So even though Hegedűs himself was originally liberal, who had gone more and more atheist, but he remained always a supporter of general suffrage and so on, it was a measure of desperation on his part too. So there were those who we need to stabilize at any cost. There was those who supported it, but there was also, of course, great resistance and the impossibility of fulfilling it because so many vested interests were chipping away at it. And how do you carry it out in a post-crisis environment when it's impossible to determine wealth in many cases? So it wasn't bringing in the kind of money. And there was a final element which I consider to be decisive. A one-time tax on wealth does not restore international trust in finances. So you can have a windfall income for the fiscus, for state finances, but it's a one-time windfall, and it certainly did not do much to restore international trust. And without international trust, the currency, unless it's tied back to some sort of a... So you either need international trust, or you need to tie your currency to something and then vouch for it. It was not possible to tie it to the gold standard because you hadn't done a financial consolidation yet, and there wasn't international trust. So ultimately, even though taxes were collected, it wasn't as successful as originally planned, and it failed to do a turnaround in the international markets and the level of support for the government.
Was there a property tax, or it was, I understand now, meant as a one-off measure?
Yes.
There was a property,
yes, but
standing property tax.
Yes, but it wasn't levied universally.
So the last discussion.
You see? Just enough for one. So I just wanted to ask the Bethlen person. So. What was his role model? So what was his role model? So was he a kind of old elite coming from the imperial age, or was it a new post-war career? So what was, because there was a break after First World War, what is a politician, what is his task, and so on and so on. So therefore the question is, was he old or was he new? And was he a person who was looking in the future, or was he a person looking in the past? And I think it's extremely important to look in this question of elites in the post-war era. So where are they coming from? And where is their information coming from? Do they have contact in the international field, or are they much more local and so on? So therefore I think Bethlen is a very good example for that question, showing is there a break or not? So which kind of politics he is doing or not?
That's such a complex question, and there's so much written about Bethlen in Hungarian historiography. Whereas I'm not a Bethlen specialist, I just know the literature. I do have an impression about Bethlehem based on what I looked at more in detail, which is historicalist thinking, but that might not be representative. My argument would be, Bethlehem is one of the few people who make a conservative turn in the old sense after 1919. Most people radicalized after 1919. Párteleki, who is essentially liberal before 1919, hangs with the social reformers, has friends from the left, goes very Catholic, very anti-Semitic, and sort of etatist, Jung conservative after 1920. Bethlen, who was far more a